is an experiment in the unmoderated, unshared conversation, which is a medium I'm very keen on, and I'm a bit nervous because I don't think it's going to work. I'm sure it will. The topic we're talking about is what it would take to convince us of the existence of the supernatural. Now, as a scientist, I've always been very willing to say something like this. Of course I'm open-minded. It only takes somebody to come along and show me the evidence for the existence of a supernatural God, and I would immediately announce my conversion. But I've always had this nagging doubt. What would it actually take? What would actually be the evidence that I would accept for the existence of a God? And historically, people have looked around and said, well, it's obvious, just look around you at the world, and you can see there's obviously got to be a God. Well, clearly we don't think that anymore. So what actually would it take? In Carl Sagan's novel, Contact, the heroine, Ellie, right at the end of the book, calculates the constant pi out to the umpteenth decimal place. And out beyond the umpteenth decimal place, she turns it into binary, and arranges the binary digits in a square matrix. And what she sees is a field of zeros with a circle of ones bisected by a diameter. And she regards this as God's signature, God's watermark written into the very fabric of mathematics. Suppose we were to sequence the DNA of some creature, any creature. You may know that the geneticist Craig Venter has actually made a bacteria and written out the genome, written out the DNA. And for very good reasons, Craig Venter has put his watermark in there. It actually says something like, this was made by J. Craig Venter, spelled out in coded DNA characters. Suppose that we looked at a natural creature and found such a watermark. Say, perhaps in Hebrew, I am Jehovah, I made this, or something of that sort. That would be an extreme which many people would accept as convincing evidence. And I would have done until recently, or for example, a great big booming bass voice, or a Paul Robeson voice suddenly booming across the mountains, or a light show up in the stars saying, I am Jehovah. You can set yourself the task of thinking what it would actually take to persuade you. Well, quite recently, a controversy has broken out over the blogosphere. Started, I think, by Steve Zara, and taken up by P.Z. Myers, and then opposed by Jerry Coyne. What Steve Zara and P.Z. Myers said was that nothing, literally nothing, would convince them of the existence of God. And the reason is that it's really a generalization of Hume on miracles. You have to convince yourself that the existence of God is more plausible than fraud, a conjuring trick, a hallucination, something of that sort. So that was what stimulated me to want to have this discussion, because I'm genuinely uncertain what I think. I genuinely don't know whether I agree with the Zara-Myers line. So I wonder, Anthony, whether you have some thoughts on what might convince you.
Well, when one poses as a topic the question, what kind of evidence would convince you that there is supernatural, and then of course one's only halfway through a sentence because you need to know supernatural what? Supernatural agencies or an agent like a God, the first tradition conceived. You've already got to a question which requires a great deal of background before it makes sense to you. It's a bit like saying to people, saying to someone who asks you whether you feel that you've been saved by the death of Christ, let us say. And you have to say, well, hang on a second, you have to go back a bit. Firstly, that this individual who was executed at that point was the Christ, and in order to accept that, you've got to go back and accept something about theism, and then you've got to go back and accept something about the existence of these kinds of non-natural entities in the universe. So you've already done a lot of legwork before the question makes sense to you. And so the question, what kind of evidence would satisfy you that there are supernatural something or others, or that supernatural events or phenomena can occur, you've already got to make some sense of what lies behind the question. It's very much like the "have you stopped using your wife" kind of question, which you simply can't answer. You can't say yes, because that meant that you used to. You can't say no, because it means you're still doing it. So you've got to say to the questioner, well, there's a presupposition behind what you're asking, which I need to deal with first. And there are a number of presuppositions behind this topic that one has to deal with. Firstly, and let's just set aside foreigners, we know what the intention of the question is, but we do need to set aside this problem about what we mean by the supernatural. The most straightforward, obvious definition is something which is outside or beyond nature, or which is cannot be understood in terms of natural laws, which is inexplicable. And the minute that you begin paraphrasing, because this is a technique I have with my students in their first year as philosophers, I say to them, when you've got a very difficult or obscure concept, try to talk about it in terms other than the ones that you're inclined to use. If you're talking about truth, or goodness, or beauty, or knowledge, try to use other terms, and then you get better purchase on it. So instead of using the word supernatural, let's use what? Inexplicable, or that doesn't fall within our normal understanding, either by common sense of how the world works, or a disciplined scientific investigation of how the world works. And the minute that you do that, you begin to see that you're being asked, what would convince you that it is an explanation of the inexplicable? Or in what way would there be evidence, presumably of the standard kind, satisfying, well-organized, convincing evidence, of things that don't fall within the normal remit of what evidence supports. So you already look as if you've got a bit of a paradox in hand, and you've got to try to make sense of what you're being asked before you can get beyond that paradox. Now, of course, in fact, it isn't a paradox, because what people are groping for is what evidence would satisfy you that there's a God as tradition conceived, or that there are angels, archangels, principalities and powers. And the answer to that is to say, well, okay, let's look at the context of this debate. What would convince me that there are certain sorts of supernatural entities? Fairies, for example, or goblins, or pixies, or trolls. What about leprechauns? I mean, we all know the story of the Irish lady who was asked if she believed in leprechauns, and she said, I do not, but they're there anyway. Or astrology, or the truth of numerology. In other words, lots and lots of examples. And the minute you begin to offer actual examples, you begin to see the difficulty that you're faced with. You begin to see that there is such a lot of legwork to be gone through before it even begins to make sense as to what sort of thing would be convincing in that case. Now, you've already hinted in your remarks about some of the responses people would give if they heard the Paul Robeson voice and they saw the great inscription in the sky. They would go to the psychiatrist first. And if they've got a team of help there, they might go to Paul Daniels, the magician, and ask him how he might have done it, and so on and so on. And the reason why I put that point is because it's very interesting. I had a case, a friend of mine who's a neurologist up at Great Western Hospital in Edinburgh, who said he was visited by an elderly gentleman who turned out to be an emeritus professor at the university there, who said to him, I had a minor stroke in the right occipital lobe of my brain, and my friend, who's very used to people self-diagnosing on the internet and coming up with all sorts of incredible diseases, a bit like the character in the Eurogator, said to him, yes, why do you think that? And he said, because I see ghostly figures rising up out of the ground, floating up through the ceiling in my left visual field. So I think I had a vascular accident, and it really was entered my brain like that. They did a scan, sure enough there was something there. 2 or 3 weeks later, when the little clot had resolved, these figures disappeared. Now you can imagine, at any other time in history, or perhaps any other person, would have interpreted these phenomena completely differently. And this is just an example of how, when you try to put certain allegedly supernatural, putatively supernatural phenomena into some sort of context, and wonder what might count as an explanation for them, you begin to see that you think very differently about it.
I suppose that if more than one person saw the hallucination, you'd be more likely people worry about the miracle of the Virgin of Fatima and things like that, where 70,000 people are alleged to have seen. Once again, it's much more plausible that they all had a hallucination, or that 1 or 2 of them did, and then the rumours spread. But if you're going to have P.Z. Myers, I think, had the example of a 900-foot high Jesus stomping over the hills, healing people, and not just healing people of the odd palsy and things, but making limbs regrow and things like that. You have to remember Clarke's third law, Arthur C. Clarke's third law. Any sufficiently advanced technology is indistinguishable from magic. And so if you went back to the Middle Ages, the Dark Ages, and presented them with almost any of the things that we take for granted, like mobile phones, aeroplanes, computers, cars, they would immediately say this is supernatural. And it would be a lot more supernatural in a way than all sorts of things that the Bible brings bring to our attention. So I'm very happy to accept the likelihood that elsewhere in the universe there is a technology, an evolved being of some sort, which has a technology so far ahead of ours that it would be equivalent to us visiting the Dark Ages in a Boeing 747 and unveiling a laptop computer and things of that sort. So I think that it's highly probable that there are in the universe beings so far advanced above us that we would worship them as gods if we encounter them. But they would be the products of an evolutionary process. They would be the products of an explicable process, even if we couldn't understand it. Supernatural, as you've said, you've got to start thinking what you mean by supernatural. That would mean not just inexplicable by our present-day standards, because for sure that's going to happen. I mean, modern quantum theory is already would be bewildering to most of us anyway, to anybody before the 20th century. The physics of 200 years' time will presumably be even more advanced.
So in fact,
we might say it was inexplicable and therefore supernatural.
And that would be just a function of our ignorance so far.
Yes.
So in effect you're saying that what would pass for supernatural in those circumstances would be habilitated into the natural, and they would come to fit into an overall scheme.
So that's a kind of shifting definition of what one would accept as supernatural.
Now there is another aspect of it, which is that people often talk about proof. And they say you can't prove that there isn't there supernatural entities. And I think this speaks of fundamental misunderstanding of the nature of proof. Because there are two quite different, importantly different senses of this term. The one which is used in formal context, in mathematics and logic, deductive proof or demonstrative proof, is in fact about the explication of what follows from certain definitions and axioms. If you take the case of logic, for example, and you look at deductive inference, take a very, very simple case, all men are mortal, Socrates is a man, therefore Socrates is mortal, you notice that the conclusion is necessitated by the premises, provided that the inference is done validly. Because all it is, in fact, is a rearrangement of the information in the premises. All deductions are, in effect, certain in that way, but they can be psychologically informative because you may not see the implication of the information in the premises. But in the contingent case, that is, in our investigations of the world, proof is a quite different matter. It's much more like what you do with a metal when you're testing for tensile strength. You're looking at how much load a piece of metal would bear before it fractured, let us say. That is literally what we mean by proving. Proving the rule is about going beyond the limits of something to see how far that thing will go. Really testing, trying out something, proving
how much gold there is in this
crime.
Exactly. By using Archimedes.
Exactly. So in all those cases, in contingent cases, proving is testing. Now the form the testing takes has to be consistent with rationality. It has to be rational inquiry. And this is a very important concept. The word rational has as its first component ratio, which means proportion. So a rational inquiry is one in which the judgments reached, the conclusions drawn, are proportional to the evidence, the strength of the evidence forward. So we mean something quite serious by rational inquiry. We mean that we are looking very, very carefully at how far we are licensed to think something on the basis of all the reasons and all the evidence that we have for sustaining it. And very often people say, well, there might be a tiny probability, 0.1, how many, 0.1,